Hi, Mark. How are you doing today?
I'm right. How are you? Where are
I'm
you?
I'm doing great. I'm in Toronto.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. First of all, there's something fantastic film and something that I really love about this film that I think a lot shares some perspective with me is I'm also from kind of a coastal community, so I feel a lot of these sorts of same things and I recognize a lot of these kinds of places. And for you as someone who has made several films now about communities like this, what's something that you would tell them about such a community if they've never been there or maybe they've just gone there on holiday? What would you tell them is the biggest takeaway from going to a coastal city?
It's hard to tell because I think it's maybe easier to tell from the outside. I've got an endless fascination of where I'm from. And in one sense, it's the only place that I can portray on screen with any authenticity. I couldn't come to Toronto and make a film. I've been to Toronto once for TIFF and I was there for 5 days. I loved it, but I've got no intimacy with it. I couldn't make a film about it. But with Cornwall, I have got intimacy, and I think I can portray it authentically, which means I can set a universal story within an authentic setting that hopefully travels, even though people haven't come to Cornwall. Having said that, I still don't understand it. I still don't understand what it is that it's the place where I'm from. So in some sense, I don't have a choice um, to I can't be from anywhere else, but I suppose I do choose to stay there. And so it's easier now, but certainly when I was starting out in my career, it wasn't the easiest place to be to have a career in the film industry. But something draws me back. So I think it's a little bit unknowable. But having a lot of people have asked me about community with regard to the film, and people have been asking me what the theme is, and I always refuse to answer that what the theme is because that's up to the audience. But a lot of people say community, and I think that is the thing that I'm kind of drawn back to, and it's the thing that's kind of the safe thing, the comforting thing is that kind of strong community you get in coastal places. It's also not all positive. I know a lot of people I've seen from a slight distance, people who've moved to our community who've got this idyllic idea of what it is, and they want to, they may live in the possibly like in the southeast of England where they live in an anonymous space where they don't know their neighbours and stuff, and they have this idea, oh, we'll move to Cornwall and live in a little community, and on the surface that seems like a great idea, and then 5 minutes after they turn up, everybody in the community knows their business, and they start craving the anonymity of urban life again. So I think you do have to be a certain type of person, and I'm not saying you have to be, that's better or worse. I think you have to be a certain person to live in a landlocked city, and I know plenty of people who do that and couldn't bear living by the coast. Um, but yeah, I think there is a strong. I think community is the thing, and somebody was I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago about the film, and they were saying that what was interesting was the community in my film is like intergenerational. So it's young people, middle-aged people, old people are kind of all interacting. And I spoke to Mary, my partner, who's in the film, and she said, "Yeah, that is something that's in Cornwall." I thought, "Yeah, in our village, everybody just hangs out together. All the generations kind of hang out together. That the borders between the generations within a community aren't there because the division is sometimes between people who live there and people who come in seasonally to visit or and making quick money out of the place. They're the division, so the generational divides aren't there. So as you can see from my answer, I don't know.
That boat was lost. Are we gonna try again?
Who's gonna crew?
I'll be back in a couple of days.
3 years Luke was on that boat. Different place back again.
See you soon, my darling.
Only one thing worse than being at sea.
Oh yeah?
Not being at sea. Don't worry. She always comes back.
No. I
No.
wouldn't know what to say.
And you did say something interesting about community, because one thing that I've noticed about communities like this is that, that sense of community does drag kind of across generations, like you were saying, but also across time. It's the kind of place where, and I think the film shows this, anyone who spends a considerable amount of time in that community is generally remembered by somebody who will be there. And I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, people go to a port city and then they will all go to wherever the wind takes them, but there'll always be like this part of them that remains in this community.
Yeah, yeah, completely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Because quite often the coast traditionally has been a place where you don't really stick around. You pass through, and a lot of people in those communities don't have any kind of home. So every bit of transient place they've been becomes a part of them. And it's a fragment that builds up a whole. And obviously that doesn't exist so much anymore. But I think it's certainly within the culture. And I think the other thing, in thinking about this, because the film was written during the pandemic, I think that was a time when the barriers between ages kind of really did break down. Because in a very real sense, the young people were sacrificing their lifestyle for the sake of the older generations to keep the older generation alive. So there was this blurring of, it was a true community. And I think that's where a lot of this film came from. I don't think of it as a COVID film, but the more I talk about it, the more I realize I was writing this film sat upstairs in my house looking out the window at our village and seeing a community functioning beautifully, while on a national level it was an absolute disaster. The people that were supposed to be looking after us were an absolute nightmare in the UK. We had Boris Johnson in charge, and that's the last thing you need in a situation like that. Whereas, like, you look out the window and the community was completely pulling together, like in a unspoken way. The kids were not going to school; they were staying in order to protect the most vulnerable in the community, and everybody was kind of looking after each other. One person would go to the shop for everybody. Somebody would shout out the window, "I'm going to the supermarket. Does anybody need anything?" And that like true community broke out in a very holistic, natural way. And I think that's one of the positives that came out of that time. And I would never have admitted it or recognized it at the time, but I do think that's in the film. And I think possibly the smaller the community, the stronger that was, or the easier for that kind of cohesive community to emerge.
Yeah. And there's always something interesting about a film that I think takes place amongst these types of people, particularly among fishermen or people that make their lives at sea, which is that they don't see the sea as like a lot of outsiders do. I think a lot of outsiders see as this like majestic, mythological place. And there is something fantastical that happens here. But what I love about the perspective that you bring to this and these characters bring to it is, for them, it's just a job. It's just another day at sea.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what it was like to create something that's balancing the realism of these characters and the world that they're based in with this fantastical journey that they kind of go on.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was my intention, was to show that the sea was a place of work. It wasn't a place of leisure. At no point do you see anybody swimming in the sea. I don't think. It's a place of work. It's a place of work that might earn you a living, if you're lucky, and it'll kill you if you're unlucky. So it's not romanticized. It's respected, and maybe part of the respect is based in the mythology, but it's not romanticized or idealized. And I think, the more grounded and the more realistic that world was, in the world of the fishing, and I was determined that the authenticity of the fishing process was put on screen. And Lee Carter, who was the owner of the boat we used, was kind of on hand for me to be a bit of a fishing consultant, to check facts with him and the way we were portraying stuff. Francis McGee, who plays the skipper, was a working fisherman before he was an actor. So there was that sort of authenticity, and I could, double check things were right with him and use my own knowledge of the fishing as well through my research and my sort of upbringing and living around that community. But it's essential that all of that was completely authentic, realistic, naturalistic, and then the supernatural can really fly beyond that. the sci-fi element, the supernatural, the mythology becomes much more distinct the more realistic the fishing aspect is. You know, they kind of really contrast with each other. So I think that was my intention at the time. It's very easy to say once the film's done and you're talking, and I'm talking to people like yourself who have a very insightful take on it and go, yeah, that was my intention all along. But, you know, even if it was unconscious, you know, it was always intentional.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, man. I really do. Lovely film. Thank you so much.
Nice to talk to you, Andrew.
Absolutely. Have a lovely day.
You too, man. Cheers.
Thanks. Like what you just saw? Why don't you check out one of these other videos? While you're at it, like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date with everything that we got going on over here. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a lovely day.